Hello there, I'm Ironclad and you are here to learn HTML and semantics. I want to say that this is not a full introduction to web development as a whole, but instead a holistic overview of HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and all of the elements that we are offered in order to write semantic markup for our websites. So we won't be going over the idea of how websites are made, etc. I'll assume you've done the basic entry work and are here to learn HTML in a way that you haven't before, hopefully. Something that I like to mention to others who are learning is that it's important to try and learn of everything at our disposal for the new thing we are learning, even if we don't understand it all. What I mean by this is when learning HTML, it is important to review and learn about all the elements that HTML offers us, even if we don't understand how to use them. This becomes useful because the more you build with HTML, you will start running into situations where you want to be more semantic, and although you didn't understand the element at the time, you will remember reading about an element that takes care of the problem or semantic situation that you're trying to solve. This wouldn't be the case if you didn't spend time at the beginning of learning said thing to find out what all is at your disposal. This translates into everything else you'll learn in life as well. That's the first time I've tried to explain and share the idea of learning everything at our disposal, so I hope it makes sense, and if not, it should become more clear by the end of this video. I also want to mention that I'll be referencing the MDN docs so that you have a full and official documentation reference in the future. MDN stands for the Mozilla Developer Network, and they've got a ton of free docs on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and practically everything regarding web development. All of the helpful links can be found in the description below. Also for this video, I'll assume you have a text editor downloaded and ready to go, but if not, I encourage you to download VS Code, as it's my preferred editor and what I'll be using for our tutorials. A link to download VS Code will be in the description below. With that being said, let's dive in. Before reviewing all of the different elements, I want to quickly review the basic skeleton or structure of an HTML file. Also to note is that the entry point or home page of a website is typically named index along with whatever file type you're working with, HTML in this case. To view HTML files, you only need a web browser, which you should have installed by default on your computer. You simply open the HTML file by double-clicking, pressing Command O on a Mac, or pressing Enter on Windows, and your browser should open it. There are only a few required tags and elements to make up an HTML page skeleton. To start, you'll see the doc type tag, which is a single tag and it defines our document as an HTML5 document. There are other doc types, but we won't be reviewing any in this tutorial, as I have never used them and doubt you will reach for them either. Just know that other doc types exist. Next, we have the HTML element, which is the main or root element of an HTML file. Inside the HTML element, we have our final two required elements, the head and body elements. We will go into more detail about this later, but the head element contains metadata, which is simply information for search engines and other tools, and contains practically nothing visual that we will see on our websites, except for one or two tags. After the head, we have the body, which is where all of our content's markup will go, and the markup inside the body is what we actually see on a website visually. So for now, until you learn more advanced tools, these are the requirements for any HTML file you will write. Comments in HTML, as well as other languages, are used for communicating with yourself and other developers. I'm only going to review how to make comments and not the theory of how to properly use them. I'll save that for a full course on web development. Comments in HTML start with an opening bracket followed by an exclamation point and two hyphens. If you are using a text editor or VS Code, then it should automatically close the comment for you. Regardless, how you close a comment is with two hyphens followed by a closing bracket. There is an alternate and much simpler way to handle commenting by using the hotkey in VS Code and possibly other text editors, and that hotkey is Control or Command plus / to comment a single or multiple lines of code instantly. So as you can see on line 11 of our index.html file, we currently have a comment. If we wanted to remove that comment, all we do is hit the hotkey and it instantly takes it away. You want to add the comment back, go ahead and do so. Just like that, Control or Command plus /. And then if you want to comment multiple lines of code, how you do so is highlight whichever lines of code you want to comment out. And again, hit that hotkey, Control plus /. It's as simple as that. If you want to comment the code out or comment it back in, all you do is select the commented code and again, hit that hotkey, and there you go, we have our code back. Now I'd like to review element syntax, which is essentially the proper way to write an element. Most elements have an opening and closing tag. Elements that don't have closing tags are referred to as self-closing elements, such as the line break and image elements, which you can see on the screen now. Closing tags start with an opening bracket, followed by a /, then the element name itself, and a closing bracket. Notice there are multiple ways to write a self-closing element, both with and without a space, and with and without a / before the closing bracket. Only the closing bracket is required to be valid in HTML5, but what I've been taught and still follow in my time as a web developer is to add the space as well as the /. To keep it simple for you, both or all three versions work, so simply choose which one you prefer and use that consistently until you find a team to work with. One simple reason I prefer the expanded version is because I believe that it keeps things more readable. Attributes for an element will always live in the opening tag, and they are written with the attribute name followed by an equal sign and quotation marks containing the attribute value. An element can have any number of attributes. Some elements have more or less required attributes, such as the source attribute on an image element. It's not technically required, but it wouldn't make much sense to use an image without a source. Since we've mentioned attributes, now let's go over those a little more in depth. All elements have access to a list of global attributes. Some elements have specific attributes that are available but not required for those specific elements. If you're curious in the future, you can reference the docs for all the attributes available for any particular element. Say you wanted to learn all of the attributes available to a form element. What you can do is go into your browser, search the MDN docs for the list of HTML elements. This link will be in the description below. Scroll all the way down until we find our form elements. So here's our form element. Click into this link for the documentation. It takes you to the form element docs. Scroll down just a bit and then you can see all of the attributes that are available for this element. To start, you can see that it includes all of the global attributes, and then we have accept care set, action, auto capitalize, autocomplete, ink type, method, name, no validate, rel, and target are all of the attributes that the form element uses, and that's how you would reference that in the future. The list of global attributes contains just under 30 attributes that can be used on any element given the appropriate situation. You can see all of them listed here, but we will only talk about a few of the most used, two of which are class and ID, and class is probably the most used global attribute. Class and ID are both used to make custom selectors for CSS and JavaScript. On the right, you can see the style attribute, which is used for inline styles. You may not reach for this a lot in the future as you get better and better, but as a beginner, you may reach for it quite a bit. Below style, you'll see the tab index attribute. The tab index attribute is an important attribute to know how to implement whenever you're working on keyboard navigation for interactive elements. Title attribute is below tab index, and what the title attribute does is give us a tooltip for free. So if you look in our HTML on line 21 for our heading, our H1 tag or element, I've given it a title of heading, so if we go to our HTML site and we hover the element, we get a little tooltip of whatever we put in that attribute. Now remember, this is a global attribute, so we can use it on any element, but don't use it too much. It can be overused. It's mainly used, if you look at the MDN documentation, on icons and other things that may not be perfectly clear just from a site. So for instance, if you have a warning icon that might not make sense or it's a specific warning, you might add a title so that someone can see what the specific warning is if they hover that element. Finally, on the left and the middle, you'll see we have data attributes, and data attributes are the wild card of our HTML attributes. We can put anything we want after the data and hyphen, so it gives us a lot of flexibility in how we can select our elements via attribute selectors. So for instance, we could say data foo or data yin, data yang, anything we want, and then select that in JavaScript or CSS. Finally, before reviewing what it means to be semantic and all of the elements at our disposal, I want to mention the HTML document's flow and how elements work within it. Elements will either be inline or block level elements. Inline elements will only take the width of the content that is inside that element. Block level elements will take the entire width of their container, forcing sibling elements to a new line, no matter what content is inside of that block level element. These are both default behaviors and can be changed via CSS, but we won't cover that in this tutorial. Links for the full list of inline and block level elements can be found in the description below. To give a quick example of how this works, take a look at our HTML and our code real quick. As far as our website goes, look at our paragraph here, which has a span and a class of highlight, which gives it this different background color to highlight it. In our HTML, you'll see that just for this example purpose, I've given an inline style in our head, and for the class name of highlight, we've given it that background color of a yellow. This is the paragraph that we're looking at right here, and this is our span with a class of highlight. So one thing to note here is that span is an inline element, so it's not going to take the full width of the container. It's only going to take the width of what's inside of it, which in this case are these two words, and you can see that reflected right here. If we were to change this into a block level element, then you'll see what happens. Now typically you wouldn't put a paragraph inside a paragraph, it's invalid, but we can still see what happens. If we refresh the HTML, since paragraph, or the P element, is a block level element, it's going to take the full width of its container, which is this entire width, and it's going to push both siblings, both before and after, to a new line. We change this back to a span and an inline element, and it flows back into the document because again, it's inline. It's also important to note that as a rule of writing valid HTML, you should not put block level elements inside of inline elements. For instance, anytime you need to link some text on the page, since the anchor, or an A element, is an inline element, you should always have it on the inside of the paragraph element instead of wrapping around the paragraph, because the paragraph is a block level element. You won't receive any errors or warnings for this if you happen to do it, so it's on us, the developers, to stay conscious of it. Being semantic means using HTML elements that provide context as to what type of content is inside them. We could write all of our websites using primarily divs, however they would not perform well on search engines like Google because they couldn't properly structure and tell what kind of content is on the website. To rank well on Google and other search engines, it takes more than just good copy and content. They want you to use semantics. Also, using semantic elements, we have access to certain functionality that comes with them by default as opposed to writing everything from scratch with a div, such as a button element having a tab index by default instead of using a div and adding that attribute manually. Also, notice in our HTML file that I'm using elements such as the header, main, and footer, as well as heading and paragraphs. I could create the same thing visually on the front end using only divs, however it would not perform as well as a semantically written website. Let's quickly recap everything we have learned thus far. We have learned what required elements make up an HTML file skeleton. We have learned how to make comments or comment out code in HTML. We reviewed element syntax and how elements have an opening and a closing tag, or they are referred to as self-closing elements. We also reviewed that attributes for an element will always live in the opening tag, and an element can technically have any number of attributes. We write attributes by the attribute name followed by the value it equals. All elements have access to the list of global attributes, and some elements have additional attributes specific to that element. Elements will either be an inline or block level element regarding the document's flow. Finally, we learned that being semantic means using elements that give context to the content that's inside of them. Now I'm going to introduce you to the majority of all HTML elements, as well as review proper use cases for a few of the elements that have similar uses. We are going to be reviewing the elements by their group or function as per the MDN docs. To start, we have the group of main root, which is simple and only holds our HTML element, which is the root element of an HTML document. Now we get into our document metadata group. First, we have the head element, which we have already reviewed as a required element in an HTML document's structure or skeleton. Next, we have the title element. The title element is one of the only elements inside the head that we can technically see reflected on the front end of our website. If you look at my code on line 12, you can see the content that I have in my title element as what's reflected in the browser tab. Learn HTML and semantics the Ironclad way. Next, we have our meta element, which has a couple of different ways to use it. For the majority of uses, the element will contain both a name and a content attribute, which holds meta information about our website, such as a description. The name attribute is to tell us what type of metadata we are writing, such as a description or keywords, and the content attribute should contain the value of that metadata. In some instances, you will write metadata, such as a character set, which looks like the second meta element you see here on line 6, and only has a char set attribute rather than a name and content attribute. To start out as a beginner, I would say that you shouldn't worry much about meta at the moment until you start learning CSS and other advanced things. But as I stated at the beginning of this tutorial, it's always good to at least know about these things and that they exist. The title element as well as the style and link elements are a few that you'll use quite a bit more to start. With that being said, let's review the style and link elements. The style element is used for writing styles directly in our HTML files. One thing to note about the style element is that it can be used in the head and body of our HTML. So as an example, if I wanted to change the background color of our HTML file, I could do so easily using a style element and some basic CSS. So if we save this and refresh the page, we can see now that we have a background color. If we comment that out and save the file and refresh, that style is now gone. I could also cut and paste this into the body of our HTML and it should work just the same. So if we refresh, you can see that even though this style is in the body, it still works. Let's place that back and refresh so it's gone. Again, the style element is used for writing styles directly in our HTML. However, as a best practice, we don't typically do that. I'd like to introduce you to the idea of separation of concerns. I won't be going into detail about this in this tutorial, but think of both our HTML markup and CSS styles as two different things or two different concerns. Also remember that as developers, we want our code to not only work on the web, but to be clean and organized so that it's easy for us and other developers to maintain and work in our codebase. The idea of separation of concerns is that just because we can write styles in our HTML doesn't mean that we should. So in order to separate these concerns, we would abstract all of our CSS to an external style sheet or sheets. And in order to do this, we are given the link element, which provides a relation from our HTML file to an external CSS file. The link element can be used for more than just CSS, but for this tutorial, we will only review it as a link for an external style sheet. So in order to do this in VS Code, let's open our Explorer and create a new file in the root of this project that's just called style.css. These are the styles that we want to take and put into that or abstract to that CSS file. So let's cut those styles and paste that into the CSS file. Now, obviously, if we save this, we have the style attribute, but if we refresh, we won't see anything. So instead of doing an inline style, we can then create a link element. Now I just use VS Code, and if we type out link and hit tab, it'll give us the two attributes that we need by default, which are rel and href. Rel is short for relation, and is telling us that the relation to this document is that this is a style sheet. Href is where that document lives. So since it's a direct sibling of our HTML file, all we should have to do is type in style.css. And I save this, and now if I were to go back to our HTML, you can see that now that we have that link to that document with those styles, it takes effect on our HTML. If we comment this link, then we lose that relation to that style sheet. Next, we have the sectioning root, which is rather simple and only includes the body element, which we previously reviewed as a required element in an HTML file structure. Next, we get into the content sectioning group. When it comes to the overall page layout, the elements you will be reaching for are header, main, aside, footer, and section or article. Also in this group, we will go over the nav element, headings, and the h group element, as well as the address element. The layout itself will most likely consist of a header, main, and footer elements, as well as an aside or sidebar, if it's applicable to the design. I believe header and footer should be rather simple and clear, but if not, let me know in the comments and I'll clear things up for you. Also to note, you can have multiple headings and footers within different elements and sections. It's just common to see one of each being used for the main header and footer of a design. Now let's talk about the main element for a moment. The main element is used to give context to the main area of a website's content. For instance, the header and footer typically only hold navigational or contact information, so it shouldn't be considered the main content. Imagine you're on a simple blog. The blog post itself, everything between the header and footer, would be considered the main content of that site. So that's what you would want to wrap in the main element. Now let's talk about sidebars and the aside element. The aside element, in my opinion, should be used either as a direct child or sibling of the main element, depending on the content of the sidebar. What do I mean by this? Remember that the main element signifies the main content of a website. If the content that is going to live in your sidebar is related to the content in main, I say use the aside element as a direct child of the main element. This is because the sidebar is actually related to the main content. If the sidebar was completely irrelevant and held something like simple online ads, then I would argue to place the aside element as a sibling of the main element instead, since ads are not your main content. Along with header and footer, multiple asides can be used on a page and in different sections if you know how to use it. I am simply referring to the overall page layout. Next, let's move on to sections and articles. They are both used for lower level sections of your website's layout. By lower level, I mean these will most likely be used inside of your main element to create different sections of the design. By default, reach for the section element when creating a section of a website. The article element is meant to be used for self-contained or isolated content. What does this mean? In other words, it means if the content inside your section is all related and makes sense on its own without the rest of the website content, then it should be an article. Otherwise, default to section. An example of this would be a list of blog posts, each using an article element. Each of these posts makes sense on their own without the rest of the website because it's an independent blog post. The list of blog posts as articles can live inside a section element. In contrast to this, a situation where we wouldn't use a section is if an entire section of a website was highlighting a single blog post. In this case, even though it's an entire section, since the only content inside of this section is related and can be isolated from the rest of the website, you would use an article. If this seems confusing or you don't yet understand it, don't worry. I will be presenting an example of this in practice later in this tutorial, which should clear things up. Next to last, we have the nav element. This element should be straightforward and it should be used as a container for any type of navigation elements you have on your website. Typically, the main navigation will be found in the header of a website unless it's a unique design. It's possible to have more than one navigation element. Consider a sidebar that has links to different sections of content. We could implement a navigation element to give context that it's not just a sidebar of text, but a sidebar of links to different areas or pages on the website. Finally, in this group, we will review headings and the address element. Headings in HTML go from H1 to H6 and are meant to be used to denote the hierarchy of importance for the sections of your website. For instance, the first section under the navigation and inside the main portion of the website will most likely use an H1 element, with some text that describes the main purpose of the page that you're on. Every subsequent section, depending on its importance on the page, will use H2 to H6. By default, the browser gives us some styling to denote the hierarchy of these elements, but this can and usually should be adjusted with CSS to match the design you're building. Along with headings comes the H-group element. The H-group element is used to group multi-level headings. Most of the time you will only use a single heading per section, but imagine you had a heading and wanted a subheading or subtitle, whatever you want to call it. For instance, we can use an H2 and an H3 in the same section, and instead of using a div or something unsemantic to group these elements, we would want to reach for the H-group element instead. Finally, we reach the address element. This is pretty straightforward and is an element that should be used as a container anytime you are writing contact information. For instance, in a lot of designs and websites, there is contact information in the footer. Whether it's just a phone number or address or even an email address, the address element should wrap this kind of content to give proper context to Google and other tools. Now let's move on to the text content group. To start, according to MDN, the div, figure, and fig caption elements belong in this group, but I actually disagree. I believe figure and fig caption should live in the image and multimedia group, so I will talk about those when we get there. The div element, in my opinion, should live in the content sectioning group that we've just reviewed as a non-semantic sectioning element. Again, this is all just my opinion. Divs should be used whenever you need to put a container around two or more elements and there is not a more appropriate semantic element to use. This is useful when styling HTML because you will learn that in order to accomplish some designs, elements might need a container to group them together. In this case, we would try to use a semantic element, but if there are none that fit the issue, then we could simply use a div. Let's quickly review paragraphs and the block quote element. The P or paragraph element should be used for any basic text content that doesn't belong in another element, such as a heading. I believe that should be pretty straightforward, but if not, then let me know in the comments. The block quote element is given to us for when we want to create an extended quotation. Block quote is a block level element and will push siblings to new lines to separate the block quote from normal text, say of a blog post. Typically for a quote, you will have a citation and you can include that citation with a block quote in one or two ways. When it comes to the proper citation, we have access to the cite attribute, which we can use on the block quote element and include a link to the source. Along with the cite attribute, if you had some text inside the block quote that was referencing the citation, you could wrap that text with a cite element which will know to refer to the actual cite attribute and source link on the block quote element. You can see an example of this on line 57 of the text editor, as well as line 59. I'll quickly mention that the HR or horizontal rule element that you see on line 60 is used for a semantic horizontal rule. You could achieve this by styling a div, but this is an element made specifically for it. Finally, there are 3 types of lists we can create in HTML: an ordered list, an unordered list, and a description list. Each of these have their own use cases which should be hinted at by their names. If you have a list of text or items that have an order, then you would want to reach for the ordered list. Ordered list will make use of numbers, Roman numerals, and letters to denote hierarchy. An example of this would be steps in a cooking guide. When it comes to ordered and unordered lists, whenever we want to make a sublist, we simply place a new OL or UL element inside of a list item. In the instance of ordered list, by default, the sub-items will use numbers 1 through X. With that being said, notice on the website how our nested ordered list is making use of lowercase letters instead. We have accomplished this on line 71 of the text editor by giving the nested ordered list a type attribute and assigning it a value of lowercase a. There are several options for the type attribute. Lowercase a is for using lowercase letters, and uppercase a for using uppercase letters. Similarly, lowercase I for lowercase Roman numerals, and uppercase I for uppercase Roman numerals. Finally, the default for this attribute is 1, which will use numbers from 1 through X. Let's quickly adjust this attribute to see the different outputs. Next, we have the unordered list, which as it sounds should be used for any list that isn't ordered or structured in a specific way. An example of this could be listing your hobbies in no particular order, mine being FPV drones and bass fishing. Notice that in this list of hobbies, the nested list has a different list style. The UL element can also take a type attribute similar to ordered list, and the possible values are disk, circle, and square. These can be manipulated further with CSS, but we are given a few choices with only HTML. Finally, we have a description list. This list is used for any time you're wanting to present some terms and definitions. Let's say we wanted to make a list describing different jobs in this industry. Since we will have terms or job titles and descriptions of that job, this is where we would reach for our description list. The description list includes elements DL, DT, and DD, which stand for description list, description term, and description details. Notice in the markup for our DT elements or terms, we are using the job titles, and for the DD or definition, we are paraphrasing the job descriptions. Again, notice how the browser gives us some default spacing and styles which can be adjusted with CSS. Next, we move on to inline text semantics. The previous group included block-level text elements, and now we are reviewing elements to be used inline as to not disturb the document's flow. To start with, there are a lot of these, and we will only review the elements I believe you will be using in the beginning of your journey. Reference the MDN list of HTML elements linked below to see what else is at your disposal. First, let's review the A or anchor element, which gives us links on a web page. To start, in order to actually create a link, you need to give the anchor element an href attribute, which stands for hypertext reference. The attribute should contain your destination URL, whether it's relative or absolute. What do I mean by relative or absolute? In programming, there are 2 types of URLs. Relative is as it sounds, a URL relative to the current file you are working in. In this instance, if I have another HTML file in the same directory as my index file called about.html, I could pass that relative URL in my href in order to navigate there. Absolute URLs require a protocol in front of them and are typically used in HTML when you are not linking to another section or page on your own website, but to an external website. For now, you only need to worry about the HTTP and HTTPS protocols, and don't worry about understanding what I'm talking about when I say protocol. That's not exactly related to HTML, so don't get hung up on it. Just know that an absolute URL starts with a protocol. Sometimes we may want a link to open up its href in a new browser tab. In order to do this, we use the target attribute and give it a value of _blank. One thing to note is that this works, but there is also an additional attribute we can provide to add some extra security against possible JavaScript attacks. We do so by adding the rel attribute and giving it a value of no referrer. I'm not going to review this in detail, so I would just say trust me that it should be used in conjunction with target_blank anytime you're opening a new tab. Finally, there are two additional types of href we can pass when we are creating a link for either emailing or calling someone. When it comes to emailing, we can prepend mail to and a colon to an email address, which you can see on line 117 of the text editor. When clicking the link, your computer should open your default email client and it will create a new draft to whoever's email address is in the href. We can even take this one step further by adding a subject line with a question mark followed by subject, an equal sign, and then the value we want the subject to be. You can see if I click this second email link, there is also a pre-populated subject field. Finally, if we have a link with a phone number and want the user to be able to make a phone call directly, we can prepend tel or tel and a colon to a phone number. The phone number should include the area code and not have any spaces or characters such as hyphens. You can see this reflected on line 119 of the text editor. If we were to click this link, it would look for an application on our computer to make the phone call. If we were on our mobile devices, such as an iPhone, then it would simply ask if we wanted to call the number, and then the default iPhone app would take over. The anchor element is the most complex inline text element to review, so the rest should be relatively quick and easy. Next, let's review the line break or BR element. I'm not sure why this is in this group because it doesn't actually contain any text, but just know that it does what it says, creates a line break pushing things to the next line. For instance, you can see on the website an empty break between the last anchor and the text with a line break, which lives on line 121 of the text editor. The text with a line break is how the element would be used in a paragraph to create an explicit line break, and you can see the code on line 122 of the text editor. Line breaks shouldn't be used for spacing, instead reach for CSS. Next, we have the cite element, which will be used for signifying that some text is cited from a source, such as a person, creative work, or organization. You don't technically have to link the citation, but it would be a good practice to follow. You can see on line 124 of the text editor that we are citing something fake from Google as an example and also using an anchor to link to the site source. Next, we have the EM or emphasis element, which, as it is named, is for signifying text that should be emphasized. These are by default styled with italics, signifying the emphasis, but can be adjusted with CSS. Next, we have the abbreviation element, which is used for wrapping abbreviations. It's useful but not required to add a title attribute to this element, presenting the full expanded version of the abbreviation. For instance, on line 128 of the text editor, we can see that I am abbreviating World Wide Web and adding the full version as the title for the abbreviation. When hovering the abbreviation in the browser, we can now see the full expanded version. Next is the strong element, which is used for signifying text that is important, which is different from emphasis. This is usually styled with a font weight of bold by default and can of course be adjusted with CSS. Next we have the mark and S or strike-through elements. The mark element is used for highlighting text which should be marked or highlighted for reference or notation purposes. You can see in the web browser that the default style for this element is a yellow background color which acts as the highlight. The S or strike-through element is used for signifying stricken through text, and you can see an example in the browser on the right. We have reviewed the block quote element, which is for larger full quotes. However, we are also given the Q or inline quotation element. This is to be used for inline quotations without breaking the flow of the document. Also notice in the markup on line 136 that I didn't add quotation marks around the quote. However, we can see quotation marks in the browser. The Q element adds quotation marks on its own. We also have access to the cite attribute on this element, which is the same as it would be used on a block quote element. Next, for fine print and legal copy, we have the small element. Typically, in a footer you will find some copyright or a mention of all rights reserved or some form of legal copy. This is the type of text that should be wrapped in a small element. Again, think of this as an element for the fine print or other types of legal copy. It's also not limited to the content in the footer. I simply use that as a prime example. Next, we have our subscript and superscript elements. You should already be familiar with what subscripts and superscripts are. If not, just do a quick Google search as it's not specific to HTML. With that being said, we simply wrap our subscripts with the sub element and wrap our superscripts with the sup or SUP element. You can see both of these on lines 140 to 141 of the text editor, and they are also seen in the browser being used for H2O in July 4th. Next, we have the time element, which is pretty straightforward and should wrap any text that represents a date or time. There are no default browser styles for this element, as it's specifically for providing semantic context and nothing special visually. Finally, in this group, we have the span element. The span element is the inline equivalent to the div element, which is a block level element. Similarly to div, you should only use the span element whenever there isn't a more appropriate semantic element, such as those we have just gone over. Typically, for a span, there are no default styles associated with it, so we simply give it a class name in order to style it with CSS. I've added a style element with some basic styles to make the span inside the paragraph larger, bold, and green. Next, let's talk about images and multimedia. When it comes to images, there are several ways to write them according to what you're trying to achieve. The elements we will be reviewing for images are image, picture, source, figure, and fig caption. I want to mention that picture and source are technically part of the embedded content group, but this is another thing that I'll disagree on in this instance. In my opinion, we should have everything for images under the images group. That's just my take on it. Don't get hung up on it. To create the most basic image, all that's required is the image element. The image element doesn't technically require, but should always use a source attribute as well as an alt attribute. The source is where the image actually lives, such as a URL, and you have seen or will see throughout the tutorial that I'm using place kitten examples in URLs. The alt attribute is short for alternate text. This means that if your image fails, either because the source is incorrect or the image actually doesn't exist, the alt text will be what is shown to the user, which you can see in the middle of the top 3 images in our browser. This is also heavily used in assistive technologies such as screen readers to describe the image on the screen. If there was no alt attribute, then users that are visually impaired wouldn't be able to tell what the images on our screen are. Imagine a screen reader saying something like this: image, this is a picture of a kitten, as opposed to just unlabeled graphic, or just image. This is why the alt attribute is highly recommended to use for accessibility compliance, which is incredibly important. Just use it and describe the image it's used on. Sometimes when creating images and other media, we will need to support a title, caption, or a credit to the media, something of that sort. To do so, we would implement the figure and fig caption elements. To start, we create a figure element, and inside of that figure element, we should have at least 2 children, a media element and the fig caption element. For an image and a figure, all you need to do is include an image element, like we just reviewed as a child of the figure. The fig caption is the text or credit for the photograph, and it can be styled however we would like. The fig caption has to either be the first or last child of the figure element. We can also wrap audio, video, and other elements with this as long as they contain a caption of some sort. Try not to use it unnecessarily. Finally, a more advanced and more recent way of creating images is to use the picture and source elements, which allow us to create a responsive image or source set without any CSS or JavaScript manipulation. We do so by starting with a picture element. Inside of the picture element, we will have at least 2 source elements and an image element. The image element is to be used as a fallback in case either or both of the source images don't work. The source elements, when it comes to images, take 2 attributes: the source set and the media attributes. The source set attribute is the same as the source attribute that you would typically use on an image element. The media attribute is the breakpoint at which each image should be shown. The media breakpoint is related to CSS, so we won't review it in depth in this tutorial, but essentially what this means is that whenever our browser is less than 1,000 pixels wide, to show the first source image, and when above 1,000 pixels, show the second source image. We can see this working in our browser. As I resize the window, the image changes. You don't need to understand everything about responsive images right now, and you might not use the picture and source set until you have a full grasp on it. It's still nice to know it exists and how it works so you can reference it in the future. Next, we have our audio and video elements. Anytime we want to embed some audio for a user to listen to, for instance on a podcast website, we will implement the audio element. We include some fallback text inside of the element in case someone's browser doesn't support the audio element, even though that's a rare case. A basic audio element takes a couple of attributes, including but not limited to the controls attribute. We use this if you'd like the user to be able to pause, play, scrub, or control the volume of the audio, which is typically what we want. Some of the other useful attributes are autoplay, loop, and muted. All 3 of these are Boolean attributes, which means their value should either be true or false and nothing else. However, notice in the markup on lines 195 to 197 that I'm not including the equals true. Since these attributes are Boolean attributes, meaning true or false, simply having the attribute on the element itself equates to being true. If autoplay is set to true, then the media will play as soon as the page loads, even if the user didn't hit play. If loop is set to true, then the media will start over as soon as it finishes playing. Finally, if muted is true, then the media will be muted by default and can be unmuted by the user, assuming the controls attribute is present. If the design calls for some type of caption or text for the media, then we can wrap it in a figure element and use fig caption, which you can see on lines 189 to 192 of the text editor. Of course, you are also required to pass the URL for the media to the source attribute or in a source element, nested inside the audio element. You use source elements inside the audio or video element when you have different versions of the same media. For instance, .wav or .mp3 regarding audio, and .webm and .mp4 regarding video. Finally, we have the video element, which is similar to the audio element in a lot of ways. It can take some text inside the element as a fallback. It has access to the same attributes as the audio element as well as a few others, and we can pass the source URL either via source attribute or source elements. Notice my second source element on lines 223 to 226. I don't actually have a WebM version of this video, but assuming I did, I would have given the proper WebM video path and changed the type of source to video/WebM. We do this because some browsers don't support particular types of video, and we always want to create as much support as we can. Finally, we can also add a track element as a child of the video element, which gives us the ability to add subtitles or captions to the video. For some reason, the subtitles don't work locally and I couldn't find a quick fix, so I won't be able to fully demonstrate the subtitles, but just know about the track element and the attributes I'm about to mention. The track element requires a few attributes such as kind, label, source, and source lang. Optionally, if you want a particular track to be the default one, we can pass the default attribute, which is another Boolean attribute. The kind attribute is to signify what kind of track this is, and the options available to us are subtitles, captions, descriptions, chapters, and metadata. The label attribute is the user-facing label used when choosing the captions inside the video player. You can see this reflected on the second video in our browser. If I change our Spanish label on line 238 to Spanish subs, then the caption option in the player should reflect that. The source attribute should be obvious and it should be the URL to the track file. In my experience, I've only used .vtt files, and you don't need to understand them for this as you won't ever build one on your own. There are tools to create VTT files to take that burden off of us. Finally, for our attributes in this example, we have the source lang, which describes the actual language the track is in. Notice on lines 233 and 240 that I am using EN and ES, which signify English and Espanol. Next, let's quickly talk about embedded content. We aren't going to review any of these elements in detail. The one that I think you would use more than any other would be the iframe element. The iframe allows you to embed an entire or portions of another website into your website. The reason we won't be reviewing these is because I don't think that you will be using them very often at the start of your journey, and I don't have a concrete example to show you how to use it. Also, by the time you start using these elements, I believe that you will be at a point where you're confident enough to research and figure out how to use it on your own. This is another example of at least knowing about what's available to us even if we don't know how to use it right now. Next we come to our scripting elements, script and no script. Script is similar to the style element in that it can be used to write JavaScript directly in our HTML files. It can also be used in a similar fashion to the link element in that it can reference an external JavaScript file using a source attribute, as you can see on line 253. The NoScript element is used as a progressive enhancement tool, which could be an entire tutorial on its own. Progressive enhancement, that is. The NoScript element is used when you want to show users some content if they have JavaScript disabled in the browsers. And yes, that's possible. This would be very useful for a very JavaScript-heavy website. Let's take a look at our text editor. Our first script element simply includes some basic JavaScript logging a string to the console. If I refresh this page with JavaScript enabled, you should see Hello World in the console. Also notice the error because I don't actually have an index file created. Now look at our NoScript element, which simply contains some text. If I disable JavaScript and reload the page, then nothing will log to the console and we will see the markup inside of NoScript. Another thing to note is that if JavaScript is enabled for the user, then nothing inside of the NoScript element will be seen or visible. This is a very niche thing, so I wouldn't get too hung up on this, just know about it and how it works. You might or might not ever run into a situation where you use it. Next, we have the Demarcating Edits elements, which are rather straightforward. We have the deleted text and inserted text elements, written DEL and INS. These elements are used for signifying that text has been deleted and or inserted, such as a difference in a code example. I don't think I have any solid examples of when to use this, so just remember that they exist, and if you ever run into a situation where text that's being presented to the user is supposed to show that it was removed and or inserted, there are semantic elements for that situation. The deleted text element shouldn't be confused with the S or strike-through element, as their purposes are different. Use strike-through when simply striking through some text for a visual effect. Now let's go over tables. Tables can be incredibly complex and honestly could warrant a tutorial of its own. For that reason, we are simply going to review the basics in this tutorial. Let's take a look at the table in our text editor. To start with, you of course need a table element. If the table needs to have some sort of title or description, then we can use the caption element. Also to note, I have included some very basic styles to make the table more visual and easier to understand what's going on. For now, ignore the commented code as I'm using it for examples in the near future. The table element can consist of a t-head, t-body, and t-foot. Let's take a look at the t-head. The first child is a table row element, which is required for every row of content you are creating. Next, we have the table heading element with a table header. Notice the call span or column span attribute with a value of 2. This is needed because for our table, we currently have 2 columns of data, and even though those 2 columns are in the table body and not in the table head, the th element will only span 1 column by default. So if I remove this attribute, you will see what happens to the table in the browser. In this instance, we are using it as a single table head, but if we wanted different columns, we would create more th elements. I will do so by uncommenting the second heading as well as removing the call span attribute from the first heading, since we have 2 cells now. You will see that we now have 2 appropriate column headings for our table. Next, let's look at our table body. This is where the meat of the table's data will live. In our body, we have created 2 rows, and in each of those rows, we have 2 columns filled with data. If I were to add a third column to the first row, notice what happens on the front end. The third column will jut out from the other table columns. To fix this, let's add another column to the head and second row, as well as adjust the call span attribute on the footer cell. Lastly, in the body, we can also add table headings in the columns. They don't just have to live in the top row or head. These elements are using the scope attribute with a value of row to signify that they are headings for the row they live on and not the column. However, notice how when I add these headings that the columns start too early. To fix this, we could add an empty th element to the head, which signifies an empty cell. We would also need to adjust our footer's call span. Finally, the table footer should be straightforward and can include fine print or anything really for the table. In this instance, let's pretend that the copy in the footer is some fine print, and notice I've wrapped it in a small element, which we reviewed earlier would be useful for text like this. You could also add more TD elements to give each column a footing if desired, but for this example, we will just use it as a full footer on the table. If it is a single footer for the table, then the call span attribute should be equal to the number of columns in the table. Now let's talk about HTML forms. Strap in. There are several aspects to form creation, one being the HTML markup and initial creation of the form itself. There are also aspects we won't cover, such as actually submitting a form and doing something with the data on the server. That's not within the scope of this tutorial. Instead, I will simply introduce you to the most common elements that we use for forms, as well as some of their attributes and how they're used. To start, as usual, we will need a form element. The form element requires 2 attributes to work properly, which are the action and method attributes. The action attribute tells us what URL or where the form should be processed, such as a PHP or Node.js file. If the attribute is empty, then the form will submit to the same page you're currently on. The method attribute tells us what type of HTTP method we should use to submit the form. The options for this are get, post, and dialog, with get and post being the most used. Getting deep into HTTP methods is also beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I will say that the get method can be used when we are submitting a form that does not have any sensitive data, such as a simple search form on a website. If we are using a form that is taking user information such as names and passwords, etc., then we should always use the post method. This is all more advanced than this tutorial, so don't get hung up on this. Inside of our form is where our input elements live. For the majority of input types, we can actually use the input element, which implements the type attribute and gives us many different options. Also, for our input, select, and text area elements, it's a good practice to include a label and associate it to that input. You associate a label with an input or text area, etc. by giving the input a unique ID. Then we include the for attribute on the label element and give it the ID of the element we are associating it with. This offers us several distinct advantages, which is why it should be used. First, it helps screen readers and other technologies associate the label such as first name with an input, which helps users know what information the input is looking for. If we didn't include a label, the user hears what type of input it is, say text, email, or number, but maybe we want to be more explicit and want them to hear first name, email address, or years of experience. Providing a label allows us to give more direct context to the data we are looking for all users. One thing to note is that most form elements are inline elements, such as label and input. If you look in the text editor at the first children of the form, you will see I've got two labels and inputs. Unless the design requires it, we typically group the inputs and labels together to stack them on top of each other to be more readable. We could do some janky things with CSS to push the labels and/or inputs to a new line, but an easier and more common alternative would be to wrap each label and input group in a div. Since the div is a block level element, this will place our form groups on new lines without any additional styling. Also, I'm using line break elements to create space between each field so it's easier for you to see. It's just for this tutorial, so don't do that in your own work. Now you can see that our first name and email address field groups are on new lines, making the form a bit cleaner. Let's dissect the input element a little further. Notice on the input elements I'm using three attributes: type, name, and ID. We already mentioned that the ID attribute is used to associate a label with an input. The name attribute is what the name of the data will be when passed to a server. If there was no name attribute on an input, then we wouldn't be able to access that data server side. Finally, we have the type attribute, which I mentioned earlier tells us what type of input we are working with, such as text, email, password, number, color, date, etc. We won't be reviewing every single type in this tutorial. Reference the MDN documentation for the input element to see what all is available. First in the form, we have a text input, which we are calling first name. We use the text input type for any general type of short form text. Also notice on this input that we have two additional attributes that I'll quickly review. The required attribute is a Boolean attribute and tells us that the input it's used on is required to submit the form. If we try submitting the form without filling this input with some value, it won't work and we will get a little message asking us to fill it in. This is what we call form validation, validating that the values we are receiving are what we expect to receive. If we expect to receive an input's value, then it should be required. The placeholder attribute is used on inputs to give some example value to the user that will be removed when the user starts typing. Whenever I start typing my name, you can see that the placeholder is removed. It will reappear if you clear the input. You can see in our first name input that I've used a placeholder as well as a label. Typically, in my experience, we don't do this, and I'm only doing this to introduce the attribute to you. I believe screen readers work better with labels than placeholders, so I think it's nice for you to know about the placeholder attribute, but I would strive to always use a label when possible. This also allows for some more interesting and animated forms when you start learning CSS. Next, we have the email input type. The email input type is only different from the text input in that it gives us some email validation by default. If a user tries to submit an email input without an @ sign followed by something like Gmail, then the form won't submit and gives the user a warning explaining the issue. This is not foolproof validation or security, but it is free for us to do without having to do any additional work simply by giving it the appropriate type. Next, we have a password input type. Similar to the email type, this gives us some additional features beyond the text type. Notice if we start typing in a password input that we don't actually see what we are typing. This is a small security feature given to us for free since passwords are sensitive. Next is the number type. Again, we get some extras with this, such as type validation and controls for increasing or decreasing the value of the input. For instance, we can type the number 5 and use the input controls to change the value. Notice we can't type normal letters into this input because we specified we are looking for a number. Next, we have the color type, which we've called favorite color. The bonuses we get from this type should be obvious. When we click the color box, we get an entire color picker pop-up, which allows us to adjust the color. We can also adjust the type of color value we receive from this input, such as RGB, HSL, or hexadecimal. You will learn more about those when learning CSS. Next is the date input, which allows us to enter or select a date. This input allows you to click into the month, day, and year individually, as well as click the calendar icon to open a calendar pop-up for date selection. When it comes to longer form text, such as a full message, we actually have a specific element for that, which is the text area element. This is not a self-closing element, so it requires a closing tag. Any text between the opening and closing tag will be in the text area by default. However, in my experience, this is typically left blank. Just like the input element, we include the name and ID attributes as well as a label. However, there is no need for the type attribute. The text area is also resizable by default, but can be adjusted and constrained via CSS. Going back to the input element, next we have the radio and checkbox types. These two types are whenever we want to present multiple options to the user for them to select either one or multiple. Radio inputs are used for a multiple choice option while only allowing one input or value to be selected. Checkboxes are used for a multiple choice option where a user can select any number of checkboxes or values. We can provide default selections by using the checked attribute on an input, which you can see for our tacos input. Notice for our radio inputs that although their values are different, they are using the same name attribute. This is because since only one of the radio inputs can be selected, we pass the same name attribute to all of our options, and the value for that data when submitted will be the value of whichever radio input we have selected at the time. In this case, when trying to access radio button server side, it would either equal pizza or tacos. When it comes to checkboxes, we give each input a unique name describing its value since more than one can be selected. If we used the same name on checkboxes, then only one of the values would actually get passed to the server because one checkbox would overwrite the other. While we are talking about radios and checkboxes, let's talk about the element that I have these inputs wrapped in. You'll notice I'm using two new elements, the field set and legend elements. We used divs to group the labels and inputs from before. However, when it comes to grouping multiple related inputs, not just labels and inputs, we are offered the field set element. It is specifically for grouping related inputs and has some default styles for us which you can see in the browser, such as a border. Inside of the field set, we should use a legend element. The legend should be describing the choice the users should make, such as selecting their favorite food. It is recommended to always include a legend with your field sets. However, sometimes a design doesn't call for it. In this case, you should still use the legend but hide it visually with CSS, so you still have valid and semantic HTML while accomplishing a design. Next, we have the select and option elements. You can think of this as an alternate way to create a radio group. Only one option can be selected, and instead of buttons, the input implements a multiple choice dropdown. One advantage here that we don't get with radio buttons is that we can create subgroups of options with the opt group element. We start with a select element, and inside of that element is where all of our option elements go. The option elements take at least a value attribute so that we can access that value on the server. Notice how the first option doesn't have a value but only some text saying to choose an option. This is the common approach to showing a message in the dropdown instead of an actual option. This is helpful because if the first option has a value, if we do not adjust that input and still submit the form, then it will become the value of the first option automatically, which we may not want. This is why we leave an empty option as the first element. Next, let's look at our opt group element. This simply wraps any nested options that your select input should have. We use the label attribute to tell the user what group it belongs to in the dropdown. Take a look at the field in our browser now. You can see when I click into the select input that I get a drop down of all of our options. You can also see that we have two normal options and two additional subgroups of options. Last but not least, let's talk about the input type of submit in the button element. We have two options when it comes to submitting forms. There is an input type of submit, which also can use the value attribute to determine the text inside of the button. If there is no value attribute used on your submit input, then it will resort to the browser default. There is also the button element, which I typically use myself. For the button element, you include whatever text you want between the opening and closing tags. Another thing to note is that whenever you use a button element in a form, it knows automatically to submit the form whenever clicked. In other areas where you use a button, it might not do anything until you write some JavaScript. I don't believe there is a right and wrong here, and it is simply preference, and either of the methods work, input or button. Decide what you like to use more and use it consistently until you join a team. One thing to note is that the button element is not exclusive to forums and should be used anywhere else on the website where there is interactivity. Finally, the last group that we will cover are the interactive elements. We will be reviewing the details and summary elements. Both of these elements work together with one another. One thing to note is that these elements do not work in Internet Explorer, so if you are ever building a website that has to support IE, avoid these elements unless support is added by that time. You can tell if it's supported by visiting the elements documentation on MDN and scrolling to the bottom of the page. Hopefully, you will never have to support IE, but it's unfortunately still possible. The details and summary element work in conjunction to give us what we might know as an accordion without having to write any custom JavaScript. Let's take a look at the example in our code editor and browser. First, notice how the elements are presented on the screen. If we click this element, which is the summary element, it will expand the details. This is commonly known as an accordion due to the expanding and contracting similar to the instrument. The idea here is that we have some type of heading that once clicked reveals some extra details about a subject. In the past, we have had to use different elements such as divs while writing custom CSS and/or JavaScript to pull this off. Now, if we look in the text editor, you can see how these elements are written. We start with a details element, and inside this lives the actual details as well as the summary element, which is what is initially seen by the user. For multiple accordions, simply create a siblings detail element with some different content. So if I uncomment this second details element, we can get an idea of how this will look in the browser. So you can see we have two details now, which can both be toggled, and they are siblings. Now we can take a big deep breath and absorb everything we have learned. I know it was a lot. For real, take a little break and come back to this tutorial. Go do something else, but continue thinking about everything you've learned and try to let it sink in. Try to remember and go over everything you've learned in your head, and if you forgot something, quickly review that section again to try to soak it up. Then come back and let's get this short practice session going. There are a few things that I'd like to go over that I feel may not have been made clear thus far throughout the tutorial, or small things that I might have missed, such as navigating page sections with the anchor element. Let's start by practicing basic page layout and page navigation, including href anchors. So currently we have a blank page, and the idea, we're not going to style anything or get fancy, we're just going to work on some basic markup. So let's just imagine that for our website we want a header. Inside of the header is typically where we might put a navigation element. Also, if you're curious about what I'm doing here, if you haven't caught on yet, if you want to quickly create an element, simply type out the element name and hit tab, and that'll create the element for you and open it for you. So again, the navigation is usually in our header, and let's just say that we want 3 links. So what we can do, again, is another little emit shortcut. Emit is an extension that helps developers with workflow speed. So for instance, we can type out the A element and hit tab to get an anchor, or we can hit Control Z, and another little tip is if we wanted 3 anchors, we can do a ×3, hit tab, and that gives us 3 anchors. So let's say we have a home page and an about page. Let's actually just do 2 for now. So a home page is always going to go to index.html. There's a few different ways you could do that, but for now let's just say index.html. And then for our about page, let's just say about.html. Let's open our Explorer. I'm not sure I have an about page. I don't. So let's just go ahead and create an about.html page. Close the Explorer so we can see everything again. One more tip for Emmet or VS Code in general is if you type the exclamation point and hit tab, it's going to know that if you're in an HTML document that you're looking for an HTML skeleton. So it's going to give you all of that with 1 little click or 2 little clicks. Also, notice some of these things are highlighted. Once we do the tab effect and create an element, every now and then there are placeholders, if you will, for our tabbing to go through. So if I hit anything right now, notice we are changing the width that was on device width. We want that to stay the same, so we're not going to change it. We're going to hit tab, and now notice we are over here at our scale. We also want that to stay at 1, so we're going to leave it. We're going to hit tab once more, and then you can see that we're instantly inside of our title element. We can change that to be whatever we want. We can just say the about page because that's what it is technically. Hit tab once more, and finally we're in the body. So for this, we're going to do almost a similar markup. We're going to do head and nav. We're going to do 2 anchors. I'm not sure why it didn't space them out properly, not a big deal. But again, we're going to do index.html, we're going to call this home, and this will be the about page, and this goes to about.html. So let's go ahead and refresh this. So this is our home page that we had, the index.html file with our 2 anchors. We hit the about page, you can see now that our anchor has changed, or sorry, our title has changed to give you proof that we're on our about page. And now we go back to our home page, about page, and this is typical page navigation. And that will be in our header. Next, let's assume that we have a main element with some main content. Let's just say for now, all we're going to do is give it an H1, which is our main heading on our website. And we're going to say this is a tutorial on HTML and semantics. If we refresh this, we now have a big heading on our website. We'll add some more content to main here in a moment, but for now, let's also just add a footer and say this is the footer. And then, actually, you know what? Let's wrap a paragraph around that and say this is the footer. Let's give one more paragraph and also wrap it in a small and say copy 2020 Ironclad tutorials. Let's refresh this and you can see now we have a footer as well as some copyright. Another thing that I want to touch on real quick before we move on is this here that you see. I have not mentioned this yet and you might have asked what it is. This is an HTML entity. There are certain characters such as the less than sign that we can't put in a string. Like we can't put this open sign inside of a paragraph because it's not technically going to work. In this case, yes, it did work, but it's not valid HTML because this is technically a reserved character. So what you would typically have to do if you ever run into an instance like this is you'd have to use the HTML entity instead, so it parses correctly and the computer knows what you're actually talking about. All HTML entities start with an ampersand and then whatever the entity code is. So for the copyright, the entity code, we'll call it is copy. If we wanted to do a less than sign, it would be LT, which stands for less than, and then you end all HTML entities with a semicolon. Also, now that we're in VS Code, let's take a little look at this. This is a IntelliSense plugin, or not plugin, it might be default with VS Code, but pretty much what it's showing us is all kinds of different HTML entities. I don't know all of them, I don't expect you to ever learn all of them, but I will say that some that you'll use, maybe a good bit more than others, might be less than, greater than, copyright, and finally, you can't just do an ampersand either, you have to actually give it the amp, which is short for ampersand, code, and then close it off as well. So if we save that and refresh, now you can see we've got copyright, less than, greater than, and an ampersand. And those are HTML entities. Let's continue with this basic page layout, and just for navigation's sake, I'm going to add some basic styles, but you don't need to worry too much about it. I'm just trying to make some different examples, if you will. Let's also add another P element. This is some text. Refresh this, and I actually want this to be, actually, you know what? Instead of a P element, let's create a section. With this section, we're going to give it an ID of section, oh, I didn't even give it an ID, I just gave it a hashtag. We're going to give it an ID of section 1. Inside of that section, we're going to have a paragraph that says, this is section 1. I want this to have an inline style as well. I want it to be very low on the page. So let's give this a margin top of a lot. I don't need that much. Let's do that maybe. So now you can see that, oh, where are we at? Margin top. Actually, so the footer, this is interesting. I'm not going to worry about debugging this, but you see our section is way below the footer, which isn't a huge deal. We're not going to worry about that at the moment. What I wanted you to see was that if I had an anchor anywhere on the page, I just want to add an anchor. And we'll call this section 1. The idea for this anchor is that I want to click this link and scroll down all the way to the section. In order to do this, we have to add the href and we pass in whatever ID of the element that we're looking for. So the ID can be on any element. In this case, it's on a section, and if we want a link to scroll down or to snap to that section, we pass in an href of the hashtag, which is the ID selector, and then section 1, which is the name of the ID. If I'm not mistaken, hopefully this works. We click this, and then boom, it takes us all the way down to the section. It looks a little odd because the section's at the very bottom. Let's do maybe 500 pixels instead. So if I click this now, you can see it kind of tries to take you down to that section, and that is navigation through different page sections with anchors. I'm also going to copy and paste this real quick because I want to give you one more example. We're going to paste all of that same stuff into the About page. Let's save that and then go to the About page and verify that it's there. Okay, so this is the About page. You can see that here with the title. Go back to the home page, and I want to mention that you can also do the same thing across different pages on your own website. So you can type about HTML and then also pass in the ID selector, and it's not only going to navigate to that page, it's going to go directly to the section. I also just noticed this is the wrong page. I didn't want to put that here. I want to put that in the index HTML files anchor. So we're on the home page, and if we click this section 1, we'll actually change it to make sense, so it'll be section 1 on about page. So if we click that, it takes us to the about page and also snaps us down to that section of the website. So that's a nice little tidbit for anchors that I didn't go over beforehand. Finally, there's two last things I'd like to go over quickly. One we'll just talk about, which is the difference between an anchor and a button. I've never been personally confused, but I believe I've seen some confusion in the web development world about when to use an anchor or use a button. And in my opinion, it's a pretty simple rule. Hopefully I'll be able to explain it clearly to you and you'll never be confused about it. The anchor element is used for page navigation. Plain and simple page navigation. If you were going to a different page on your website, then you should be using an anchor. If you're going to a different section on your website, you should be using an anchor. If you're going to someone else's website, you should be using an anchor. If it's navigating somewhere, it's an anchor. A button should only be used for interactivity. For instance, if we had a hamburger icon that was supposed to open a fancy menu, we would use a button for that because it gives us a tab index by default, which makes it interactive, and it's not navigating anything, it's just making something interactive. Hopefully that made sense. Again, anchor for navigation, button for interactivity. Finally, the last thing I'd like to go over to hopefully make a little more clear are the differences between section versus article. And we're going to do so by looking at my own blog's design. It's not maybe the best example, but we should be able to go over it a little bit. I mentioned earlier that whenever you're building a website, to by default reach for sections when creating a section of a website. So if we look in this design, we've got our content. Obviously you can see in here that I've named this layer main, so I'm already thinking about my markup when I'm designing a file. So let's just say this would be my main, and then inside of that we have content. Inside of this content section, we've got several different things. I don't have these properly named as sections like I would in markup, but you can see that this kind of is its own little section, and it might even be included with this. So this would be a section of content. This here also, it might be included in this section, or it could be its own section. Finally, the point where we'll actually see the difference between section and article is something like my latest post section. For this section, the entire thing, including the title and the button, etc., all of this will be wrapped in a section element. For each blog post, this is where we would use an article. Each of these elements should be wrapped in an article because each blog post is self-contained and can make sense on its own without any of this other stuff on the page. So for instance, this blog post, if you were to read this content, it would make sense. Again, let's go over to the all post page. We have a section, which is like a hero section. Then again, this whole thing is in a section, but each of these elements are articles because they stand out. Now I mentioned in contrast where you might not use a section, where you might use an article instead. And for instance, on the blog detail page, this is where we might use an article instead of a section. We might still use a section for our hero area, but for this, we could typically use a section, but since all of this content that we see is specific to this blog post, I would use an article here. There's no need to use a section. You don't need to wrap an article in a section just to try and be semantic. You only need to use one or the other. And you can use sections inside articles, and you can use articles inside sections. Just remember that you should default to sections and use articles anytime the content stands out on its own. So that's all I've got for you today, and I hope you learned a thing or two. I put a lot of effort into this, so I'm hoping this will be the new go-to resource for beginners learning HTML. If you have something else that you think I'd be good at teaching and you're interested in learning it the Ironclad way, let me know in the comments below. I want to continue teaching and making this content for you, and eventually I'd like to release a full course on everything I know inside and out about being a web developer and tech-savvy person in general. My goal for this video is to reach 100 subscribers, and at the time of uploading I am currently at 52, so I think we can make that happen, yeah? If you've learned something from this tutorial, please consider hitting the subscribe button as well as the like button. It helps this video get seen more, and I made it to help others. You can follow me on Twitter at I'm_Ironclad and check out my other YouTube channels where I'm recording my hobbies of FPV drones and fishing. You can see both of those in cards on the screen now. However, my personal YouTube channel is the one I'd like for you to watch if anything, because I have a big ambitious goal that I'd like for you to know about. That's also linked in a card as well. Finally, I have uploaded the index.html file with the different groups of elements to a GitHub repo, which is linked in the description below if you'd like to reference it. Thank you for watching, especially if you've stuck it out to this far in the video. I appreciate you being here, I hope you've learned something, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.